Well, hello everyone. We're trying something here. This is just a very brief overview of Western notation. We will hopefully look at some other notational traditions as we go along here, but we'll start with the Western notation. What you see before you is a 5-line staff, which is the standard move here in Western art music. And I'm going to get rid of those. I'm going to get rid of those rests so as to uh, give us something we can work with here. So staff attributes. This is a program I use called Finale. It's pretty solid, but it's not without its vagaries. So anyway, you have a 5-line staff. At the beginning of each staff, you have what's called a clef. Now, the clef comes from the word clave, which is Latin for key, because it tells you what note is what. The treble clef is a G clef, because we see that little swirl right there. It's circling the pitch it's identifying as G5, or G4, excuse me. So this is called a G clef because it tells you where G is. There are some other clefs. You're probably familiar with the bass clef, which looks like this. And that is called an F clef because the 2 dots and the beginning of the little swirl there signify the note F, in this case F3. But there are also C clefs. And C clefs look something like this. This one here is called the alto clef. Puts middle C, C4, right on the middle of the staff. Violists, alto trombonists use the alto clef quite a lot. There's also the alto clef's first cousin, the tenor clef, which puts C on the second line from the top, 4th line up, C4, middle C. And those are the 4 kind of standard clefs. There are others, such as the baritone clef. Notice it's the same F clef as the bass clef, but in this case, F is down a step, which means you got higher notes up here that you would access that you wouldn't get in the bass clef. Sometimes that is also shown as this. This is also the baritone clef because this has got middle C here. The previous baritone clef had it F right there, and of course F to C with the same line. So it's 2 different ways of saying the same thing, essentially. You also have the mezzo-soprano clef and the soprano clef. And we don't use mezzo-soprano or soprano or baritone clef too often anymore, but at the time of J.S. Bach, all 70s clefs were pretty standard. You also have 8BA and 8BB clefs. In other words, if you see like this, it means that everything sounds an octave higher than written. If you see this, everything sounds an octave lower than written. The octave clefs aren't actually used very often at all, so we don't think about those too much, but they are a thing that exist. So let's go back to treble clef to start here. And anytime you're dealing with a clef, you have to deal with the length of stems and things like that. Now, a whole note is pretty easy because it has no stem. It just is what it is. But a half note, which takes up half of it, will require a stem. Now, notice the stem length, first of all. It's about the length of 3 spaces. And notice how it falls. When the pitch is on the middle line or above, the stem points down. And this is true regardless of clef. When it's below the middle line, the stem points up. And even if you get far away into the ledger line zone, you'll notice at a certain point as I keep going up or down, the stems end up staying the same length. If it's farther than 3 spaces from the center line, it's just going to extend to the center line regardless. So that's an interesting little thing about that. In terms of how we label the pitches, well, we turn to C natural here. Let me erase these, get them out of the way here. Oh, before I get to that, let's talk about quarter notes for a second, or 4 in a measure, 4/4. Eighth notes, when they're like this by themselves, you notice that we call that a flag, but if we have two of them together, we beam them together, and depending on the meter, we might put them in the same way. There's also the idea of the tie, which connects two notes and basically means you perform it without any rearticulation. This doesn't need to be in this key, for example. We can transpose it. We highlight it here. We transpose it down a perfect fifth. We'll talk about transposition as we get a little farther on. Those of you who are extremely online may recognize this, but I'm not going to spoil it. Ask your friends what that's all about. So when we're dealing with notation, we also have to deal with note names. Of course, there are just the 7 note names we deal with: A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then we start to repeat ourselves. One of the interesting things about it, if you look at German language scores, you occasionally see that. And you're thinking, well, how the heck does that work? Well, without going too much into the history of it, in German language scores, when they say B, what they mean is our B flat. And when they say H, what they mean is our B. And we can talk about that later, but it has to do with the idea of the hard versus the soft B and the shape of the notes. And it's kind of fascinating. But if you ever see something in H-mol or something like that, don't panic. We didn't create an extra note when you weren't looking. It's just a thing that they do. So you have the 7 note names, and of course you can sharp or flat any one of them depending on context. And then what we do when we're dealing with this particular type of music, we have our octave nomenclature, because there are multiple A's, multiple B's, etc., to be able to tell them apart. So we use numbers to help us out. So C4 is middle C, that note right there. It's the numbers go from C to C, so or from C to B, I should say. So C4, D4, E4, F4, G4, A4, B4, and then up there that would become C5. So it doesn't quite line up with the letters, which of course start on A. So down at the very, very bottom of the keyboard, you're going to have A0, and then A sharp or B flat 0, and B0, and then C1 would be the lowest sounding C on the keyboard. This goes all the way up to C8. So if the range of the modern piano, for example, will run from, as it's usually notated, in bass clef, and when you change clefs in the middle of a piece, it usually goes before the next bar line like that. All the way to, see if I can do this here. So that's C2, C1, A0 is the lowest note on the keyboard. And that goes all the way up to, yes, I had to change clef because the number of ledger lines you need to do this in bass clef would be absolutely ridiculous. It's pretty ridiculous in treble clef, but in bass clef it would be unbelievably so. So C5, C6, 7, C8, all the way up there. That's a lot of ledger lines to keep track of. So one of the things we can do, and to make that a little easier, is to put symbols to help us out. So this is supposed to be A0. I'm going to bump that up to A1, but I'm going to add something to it. 8VB, ottavo basso, means octave below. So if you play that, it'd be the same as playing the one with all the ledger lines. Likewise here, I can take this down a peg to there and add in this ottavo alto, which means octave above. Or if I really want to save ink and try to keep track of ledger lines, I can put it here. And one of the options you can do, and I will fess up right now that I don't know the proper Italian term for this, but Finale does have a thing for it. 15 MA, or 2 octaves above. So these two pitches will sound exactly the same. Likewise, for the octave below, if I wanted to, I could do this and get rid of that, and instead use the 15 MB to go below. So that was different ways of playing the same pitch at the very bottom of the piano. So you keep track of those. You should be okay for a lot of these, but this is going all the way from A0. We're keeping score here. To C8. C8. It's a lot of real estate, and there are pitches both above and below. There's a type of piano called the Bösendorfer piano. Franz Liszt actually wrote some pieces that involve notes that are too low for the modern piano, so the Bösendorfer Corporation created a piano that had those extra notes. I think it goes down to just like F, what would be F0. But anything outside of essentially the range of the piano becomes very difficult for us to hear because of the frequencies involved. Below A0, the vibrations just aren't quite fast enough for us to hear. And above C8, they're too fast. It's just too high. Now, if you have a dog in the room, if you play above C8, you might get their attention. But anything above that is going to be more and more difficult for humans to hear. And once you get to about a fourth or fifth above C8, we just simply can't hear it. So anyway, this is a start, and hopefully this answers a few questions. We'll be adding more videos as we go along here. But thank you very much for your time, and I hope everyone has a great day. Now let's see if I can figure out how to stop this.